Hello, and welcome to Trans Truth, the podcast dedicated to dispelling myths, fear, and ignorance about transgender people. Along the way, we'll be sharing items of interest to the transgender community, from political and news events to health, fashion, and beauty. And now, let's have a look at some news items that should be of interest to our listeners. Pink News has a story on A-list actress Annette Bening and how she eventually became a rather fierce trans advocate, inspired by her trans son, Stephen Ira, who she shares with husband and fellow Hollywood star Warren Beatty. Bening went into detail about how she sees the debate about trans rights as so damaging. Quote, "For me, the real transition has happened as the right wing in the U.S. has become more and more mobilized on misinforming people about the LGBTQ community. They have been vilifying our community and creating problems that do not exist and creating and sowing hate and fear as a way of rallying their base." Unquote. I must say that it's gratifying indeed to see high-profile celebrities have seen and are speaking up about the same patterns of propaganda and fear-mongering that we have here at Trans Truth. The Independent reported that on Friday, August 19th, Laura Ann Carlton, the 66-year-old owner of the Magpie clothing store in Lake Arrowhead, California, was shot and killed in her store. Miss Carlton's attacker was 27-year-old Travis Ikaguchi. Witnesses say that he confronted Carlton about the large pride flag that hung outside her store. After a heated argument in which Ikaguchi repeatedly hurled homophobic slurs at Carlton, he shot her dead. He was confronted by law enforcement a short time later and suffered one or more fatal gunshot wounds in a lethal force encounter. By most accounts, Ikaguchi was a disaffected loser with a history of antisocial and anti-LGBT rants on social media. Laura Ann Carlton, on the other hand, was known as a fearless and tireless ally of the LGBT community. The world is poorer without her in it, if slightly better for no longer having Travis Ikaguchi in it. The Jurist reports that Texas District Court Judge Maria Conti Hexel has temporarily blocked Senate Bill 14, the recently passed Texas law which bans gender-affirming care for minors and restricts children already taking gender-affirming prescription drugs. You know, all that stuff that people who know what they're talking about say we should be doing to actually protect the children. The Texas Attorney General's office has already stated that they will appeal. The Washington Post reports on the almost unbelievable story of how a gifted and caring sex educator has had her work attacked at every turn by Christian-dominated Ottawa County Board of Commissioners. The actions have been led by the board's vice chair, Sylvia Rodia. Like all too many Christian conservatives, Rodia sees sinister forces behind all LGBTQ+ groups, their allies, and even pride flags. Said Rodia in a recent meeting of the board, quote, "It's time to define the plus," referring to the LGBT+ movement. Over 50 flags are flown under the LGBTQ+ flag, Rodia said. Their ranks, she asserted, included pedophiles, polygamists, and furries, which she described as those who dress as furry animals and may use litter boxes. We have a serious problem on our hands, campers, when important government bodies, like a board of county commissioners, can be dominated by people who believe this hogwash, which has been so thoroughly debunked. Why is no one asking them to produce evidence that the LGBTQ plus community is such a threat to the children? Why is no one pointing out to them that most pedophiles are, by far, white males? This madness has been playing out all over our country with increasing frequency. As we're going to see in this episode of Trans Truth, it's because someone is trying very hard to get fearful and ignorant people to view the LGBTQ plus community as a threat. Well, hello again, and welcome back to Trans Truth. I am your host, Kelly Nelson. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am joined, as always, by...
I'm Jerry Ann, and my pronouns are also she, her, and hers.
So, Jerry Ann, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, Kelly, in only our second episode, published over a year ago, we addressed the phenomenon of transphobia and the reasons that exist, such as simple ignorance.
Right. But before we dive in, I wanted to get this out of the way right up front. I have a confession to make.
Okay. Do I need to sit down for this?
You might.
Okay.
Here's the thing. I am a transsexual, and I was born that way. I was also born a sinner. My sin is mentioned no less than 25 times in the Bible. I tried to change, but I couldn't. Luckily, society eventually learned to accept us, left-handed people.
Oh, that's cool. You had me going there for a minute.
Thanks to Seth Walker, one of my Facebook friends, for sharing that material with me. Okay, Jerry-Ann, you were saying...
Well, I'm not sure I can remember what I was saying after
that. We were talking about the reasons that transphobia exists.
Yeah, here's from the notes of that episode. One reason is simple ignorance. That's got to be the number one reason that people fear or even hate us. Also, there's not too many of us out there. Most people have never encountered a trans person. So they're completely unfamiliar with terms like gender dysphoria, let alone the well-established standards of care for the treatment of it. And I've run into that in my work with rodeo. That's a different kind of culture. And I have made friends with a lot of people who have never been in the company of a transgender person, in particular a transsexual. And that's led to some very interesting conversations.
I was just going to ask, what does that look like? How do you become aware that they're ignorant? And we should be clear, we're not using ignorant in any form of the pejorative. Ignorance just means lack of knowledge.
Lack of knowledge, exactly. And I always recognize the puzzled look on their face. Kind of a posture of uncomfortableness, because this is a subject they've never talked about before. And I immediately reassure them and tell them, so look, I'm an open book. You ask me what you want. I said, I reserve the right to privacy. If a question gets too private, I'll just let you know and we'll move on from there. But go ahead, ask me whatever you want. And so I've been in a position to educate some people about that. But the fact is, most people have never encountered a trans person. Another...
let's talk a little bit more about that.
Sure.
About that education process. Because, yeah, you're absolutely right. Most people have never encountered a trans person, and we all know that look. It sometimes is pretty dramatic, that wide-eyed, gape-mouthed moment of realization when they realize that they're dealing with one of us. But I don't know about you, but I have found that a smile and, an explanation that puts them at ease makes all the difference. All the difference. Something like, if they misgender me, I'll say, well, no, it's ma'am, actually. But don't worry, I get that a lot. And they're almost always apologetic and hungry to learn more, to learn how they can be a nicer human being.
Sure, sure, exactly. You know, a smile and a pleasant countenance, so to speak, would work for a stranger. Not take it many steps farther than that. I'm captain of my rodeo team, and this year I'm going to have about 12 rookies on the team, and I'm making a point to invite every one of them to my home to share a meal with me and spend several hours getting to know each other. And so that's more than just a smile. That's my attempt to make them think that I'm the best thing that ever happened to them. And when all is said and done, I will have done that with 12 new people on my team, 2 or 3 at a time. So,
And that's what it boils down to. It's education really doesn't quite define it, what we're talking about. The right wingers would say we're indoctrinating those people,
you
but
know,
what we're really doing is just being polite, putting our guests or the people that we're interacting with at ease, because it is a new thing to them, and sometimes kind of scary because they probably heard a lot of negative things about trans people.
well, sure. And I've had little episodes where that popped up somewhat too. So, but what confuses people is the very idea that gender and biological sex are two very different things. It
Yeah,
defies common sense.
exactly. It does.
And for those who have never encountered a trans person or who've never been exposed to the major strides that have been made in the understanding of gender dysphoria, the very idea that one can identify as a gender other than their biological sex, it's a pretty big leap. I mean, for most people, there's male and female.
Right.
Yeah, there's some, you know, kind of butchy females and some effeminate males, but you know, to make that leap between
Yeah,
is a quantum leap. It must well be a quantum leap because
yeah, it's just too strange to accept that someone telling them that their common sense isn't all that common. It is a big leap. And when you've got things that are going on now with the culture wars and the lies and propaganda being heaped upon the public by the right just to solidify their political agenda, it makes it that much harder.
well, and on top of that, when forced to confront the notion that children who suffer from gender dysphoria need to be treated under a similar standard of care developed specifically for pediatric patients, or even higher level of alarm is to be expected. When it comes to kids, people freak out.
Yet they do, and it breaks my heart that anyone would be so cynical as to exploit that understandable fear for the well-being of children. It just, like I said, it breaks my heart, and then it makes me angry.
Sure. For much of my life, I thought I was a freak. I thought there was something wrong with me because I was not exposed to information to the contrary. And it's no wonder that the professional community still considered any form of gender nonconformity to be a mental illness or a disorder.
Yeah, it wasn't. It wasn't. Well, it wasn't very long ago that it was just another mental illness, and there were no studies done on our class. There was just a lot of no good information.
So I don't know a whole lot about the DSM, and there's different versions of that. Can you just briefly
Sure.
talk about that for our audience?
Yep. We talk about the standard of care and research and that kind of thing. Bearing in mind that we are between, I think, 0.45 and 1.6% of the population, it should be no surprise that there hasn't been much in the way of academic attention being paid to gender dysphoria and transgender people in general. But there is one gold standard when it comes to, well, labels, if nothing else, and that is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. We are currently, or the DSM, we're currently on the 5th edition, the DSM 5, and that is the most recent publication of the reference used by virtually every mental health practitioner. And the DSM 5 was the first edition to remove gender identity disorder from its text. And that happened just a few years ago. I'm thinking like 7 or 8. And the DSM 4 had replaced the term transsexualism with gender identity disorder when it was published in 1994. So you can see a trend here that the even the mental health care community really didn't know how to define us and deal with us, but they've gotten better over the years. The term transsexual did not even appear in the DSM until the 3rd edition, which was published in 1980.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I can't believe that.
Yeah, it was a surprise to me when I read that too. And I have to tell you, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is some very dry reading, but it's like the Merck Manual has been for MDs for more than a century. And I'm sure you're asking, as are most of our listeners.
What is the Merck Manual?
What's the Merck Manual? The Merck Manual, well, this is, I'm going back to when I was a paramedic student back in the 19th. And from the Merck Manual's website, we learn that the first edition was published by Merck and Company, as a small reference book for physicians and pharmacists. The publishers pointed out to their audience that memory is treacherous, unquote, meaning that a ready reference was often more accurate than something they learned in medical school and seldom, if ever, used since. Anyway, that book has always been published pocket size. And the printed version is really thick, probably a good 2.5 inches, but it's paperback size, specifically so it'll fit in the pocket of a lab coat. And those of you who encountered doctors especially in a hospital setting, any more than 20 or 30 years ago, probably noticed that big rectangular bulge in the doctor's lab coat. That was the Merck Manual. Everybody from the interns on carried a copy of it around with them. And
hold on right there. Hold on. Do you know that officials, sports officials, like a basketball official and baseball official, they're told in official school, do not ever be seen reading the manual. Think about that.
I assume that's because you don't want to look like you don't know what you're doing.
Well, yeah. So how does that relate to doctors checking the manual?
Well, the medical profession in general isn't hung up on appearance. They value quality care far more than appearance. So if you need to look something up, you better damn do it, because you want to be right rather than look good.
Well, I get that.
So anyway, that's a long way of saying that the odds are that unless you're a medical or psychological practitioner, you've probably never even heard of either volume, either reference, either authority. So again, ignorance abounds. And let me be clear, I use the term again, let me be clear again, I use the term ignorance with absolutely no derogatory intent. We're simply facing a lack of knowledge.
Okay. So that brings us to another closely related cause of transphobia, propaganda. And, I know that you have been doing a lot of research here lately on just that topic. So why don't you just bring us up to speed with what you've learned lately?
Okay. Well, we've documented and discussed repeatedly, like in almost every episode somewhere, there is currently a coordinated campaign of fear mongering by the Republican Party and other right wing hate groups. That campaign is designed to foster the notion that the very idea that the efficacy of evidence based gender affirming care is evidence of a sinister campaign to corrupt our children. And to be fair, like any good conspiracy theory, these alarmists note that the increasing incidence of people, especially younger people, expressing gender other than the one associated with their biological sex, there is an increasing frequency of that appearing. And it's true. In barely a generation, our understanding, our acceptance of transgender people has grown dramatically. For many, it's an easy step, an easy leap to the idea that this must be the result of some sinister agenda, especially when their authority figures are telling them that that's exactly what's happening. Of course, in truth, we've always been here. It's only this very recent change in attitude and understanding that is causing more of us to come out and assert our right to exist. Jan, you talked about early on in your life, there was nothing to explain to you why you were feeling the way you did, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So, unsurprisingly, there was no help. There was certainly no acceptance and understanding. But even the vast majority of medical or psychiatric authorities you could have gone to would not have been able to put their finger on what was wrong with you.
Well, let me stop you right there. It's we've talked about this lack of knowledge. We've talked about this fear and this political agenda, and it seems like the people promoting the propaganda and the false information are appealing to a type of people who readily accept what they're told. That's what's so crazy about this, and at the cost of the rights of other people. And I tell you, I don't know. I haven't kept up with current events like you have lately. Of course, I'm exposed to some, but not to the extent that you are. But I do know a little bit about history, and what frightens me about this is a famous man once said, "The art of propaganda lies in understanding the emotional ideas of the great masses and finding, through a psychologically correct form, the way the attention and thence to the heart of the broad masses."
Oh, we are going to talk about that. You're absolutely right. And
That's scary, isn't
it is, and to be fair, and I have said this for years, you got to hand it to the right. They have taken the lessons of some famous or infamous propagandists to heart.
Well,
They know it works.
You know who is credited with this quote I just gave you?
I'm afraid to guess.
Adolf Hitler.
I knew it.
Adolf Hitler.
I knew it. Yep. We're gonna talk. Well, we had a whole episode called "Propaganda Then and Now" that we dedicated into comparing the techniques of propaganda and how similar the current fear campaign against the transgender community is to the campaign against the Jews and other minorities in 1930s Germany. And we'll talk more about that. But rest assured, we're not comparing our lot to the Holocaust, at least not yet. But we are drawing some very stark similarities to our lot and the lot of those Jews and the campaign of propaganda in pre-war Nazi Germany.
Well, let's go back to the to present day. How about leaders in current times? Let's talk about that.
Okay.
Give us some background about why propaganda is such a catalyst for transphobia.
Sure. Well, we talked early on in this episode about how transphobia is an easy leap. It's an easy thing to be afraid of when you're confronted with something that is such a break with what seems like common sense. There are two sexes, male and female. Setting aside the extremely rare case of intersex people, but basically, when it comes to biological sex, it's binary. When people are confronted with the idea that common sense isn't quite right, we want to push back. And when another group starts telling you things that reinforce your preconceived notion, your common sense, that's an easy leap. And we're talking about the group that needs that affirmation, that needs to have someone be the authority for their moral judgments. They're frankly not comfortable making it on their own. And there have been a number of books published and studies done on that kind of mindset. For some background on why propaganda is such a catalyst for transphobia, we're going to lean on an article I recently read. It was published on Politico and entitled, "What Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Viktor Orban Understand About Your Brain." In that article, author Marcel Danesi discusses the similarities between despots and would-be despots like former President Donald Trump, Hungary's Viktor Orban, and Russia's Vladimir Putin. Like other populist figures have done throughout history, these characters use words, both written and spoken, to invoke emotional responses in their followers. As we noted in episode 7, one of the 9 fundamentals of effective propaganda is to, quote, provoke. First attract attention, then appeal to emotions.
Oh, hold it right there. Hold it. That's exactly what Hitler said when he said emotional ideas of the great masses and finding through a psychologically correct form the way to the attention and thence to the heart of the broad masses.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah. Emotion is a huge part of propaganda. It is clearly been reduced to a science on how to manipulate people with propaganda.
Well, going with these nutcases, you got me going now.
Yeah, so effective have the masters of that kind of propaganda been at this kind of manipulation. They can even incite people who consider themselves patriots, for example, to seize our nation's capital in an attempt to overthrow the results of a presidential election. That's just one recent example, but every one of those people on the Capitol steps on January 6th would have told you they were working to defend the Constitution.
Right.
So effective has been the manipulation of their mind. So is it fair to say the public is being worked?
Duh.
Yes, I'd say. It certainly seems that propaganda has had an effect, and some smart people have been studying and measuring that effect. In 2022, Pew Research published the results of a poll that shows that Americans' views about transgender people have changed significantly in just a few years. In September of 2017, 54% of adults in the U.S. believed that gender is determined by sex assigned at birth. In June of 2021, that number was 56%. It had creeped up in a little less than a year by 2%. But in May of 2022, that number had risen to 60%. So in less than 2 years, in less than 5 years, that number went up 6%. And that's an increase of 6% in just 4.5 years. And with most of that change coming in the last year represented in the study. Interestingly, 64% of those surveyed strongly favored protecting trans people from discrimination. Now, the article I read about that study, and the study itself didn't offer any real explanation for that disconnect. Why 64% people favored protecting us, but 60% insisted against all science that gender and sex were the same thing. Age also showed some major differences. Half of those in the 18 to 29 age group understood that gender is not determined by sex at birth. That number drops to 40% for those 30 to 49, and about 30% for those 50 and older. And unsurprisingly, party affiliation also showed some similar differences. Democrats and those who lean Democratic are more than 4 times more likely than Republicans to understand that gender and sex are 2 different things, whereas 66% of Republicans believe that the U.S. has gone too far in accepting people who are transgender. I'm going to go not very far out on a limb here and say that the nationally coordinated campaign of anti-trans propaganda we've been talking about has contributed to these changes.
Duh.
My goodness. It reminds me of another famous quote. Guy said, "The great masses of the people will more easily fall victim to a big lie than a small one."
Now that one sounds familiar.
Well, it should. It was, again, Adolf Hitler.
Oh, I was going to guess Goebbels, but I was close.
No, same dude. Keeps popping up in these current events in my mind. Go ahead.
By now, most of our listeners have probably heard about the landslide failure of the Ohio ballot issue number 1. That was just a few weeks ago, and that measure was an attempt by right-wing extremists to make it harder to amend the state constitution in Ohio. This was in advance. This was a strategic move in advance of an anticipated abortion rights ballot issue this fall, which would constitutionally protect the reproductive rights of women.
So why are we talking about Ohio issue 1?
Well, let me just play the audio of the clip and talk about what the clip is showing, and then we can talk about why I want us to pay attention to things like this.
You promised you'd keep the bad guys away. Protect her. Now's your chance. Out-of-state special interests that put trans ideology in classrooms and encourage sex changes for kids are hiding behind slick ads. Don't be fooled. You can keep this madness out of Ohio classrooms and protect your rights as a parent by voting yes on August 8th. Keep your promise to her. Vote yes on August 8th.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there, but let's explain that commercial, Your Promise, opened with the image of a young girl being tucked into bed, and you heard what the narrator had to say, and I read an analysis that had been aired by NBC affiliate WCMH in Columbus, Ohio, and they addressed the claims made in that clip thusly. 1, the out-of-state interests the ads talked about are Planned Parenthood and the American Civil Liberties Union. Both have operations in Ohio. Both have also advocated to protect abortion rights and encouraged Ohio voters to reject issue 1. 2. The ad never once mentioned abortion. If that's not prima facie evidence of transphobia being exploited for political gain, I don't know what is. The article then asks if those organizations, quote, put trans ideology in classroom. And then the analysis goes on to note that this claim was made over video of a drag queen story time. Yes, I know that our audience understands the difference between drag and gender dysphoria, but as we have consistently pointed out, the public, by and large, does not. You've got to hand it to those right-wing hate groups yet again. They know an ill-informed electorate when they see one and seldom miss an opportunity to exploit fear and ignorance for political gain, said Mehek Cook, a spokesman for the Protect Women Ohio group that put on that ad. Transgender surgeries and allowing for that type of activity of our children is on the ballot, so this ad exposes that, unquote. No, the ad is, yet again, repeating the lies about surgeries on transgender kids. There seems to be this belief that it's something that's contagious, or you can make somebody be trans or make somebody be LGBTQ, said Aaron Upchurch, the executive director of the Kaleidoscope Youth Center, which advocates for LGBTQ youth in Columbus. It's a lot of fear. You cannot make someone trans. You cannot make somebody LGBTQ. So are issue 1 opponents encouraging sex changes for kids? Quote, our amendment does not provide a right to a sex change operation or a minor, or indeed for anyone, said, unquote, said Frida Levinson, the legal director of the ACLU Ohio. Indeed, the Ohio Capital Journal article that reported on the landslide failure of Measure 1 noted that Issue 1 proponent Frank LaRose and his allies had unashamedly claimed that abortion rights that will be on the November ballot would allow minors to undergo sex changes without their parents' permissions. Legal experts told the Cincinnati Enquirer that is highly unlikely for many reasons. The article also reported that Ohio Children's Hospital Association has said in testimony at the State House that under their standards, this does not happen in Ohio. Jerry Ann, we at Trans Truth have been making the debunking of the pearl-clutching false claims like this about sex changes for kids a central theme in our editorial reporting, noting repeatedly that no accepted standard of care allows for any irreversible treatments or on minor transgender patients.
What's obviously missing in this whole discussion is the mere fact that they never mention anything about a kid being mutilated, nor the doctor that did that. No, they can't.
You mean like real examples of when that happens?
A real example of it having happened. So they're legislating something that has never happened just because they have instilled the fear in their fellowship to get the votes. That's it.
Well, I gotta challenge that. Just kind of. In our detransition episode, we talked about that and regret of permanent gender affirming care procedures does occur. It's extremely rare, so rare that in virtually any other field of medicine, the success rate for that kind of treatment is enviable. The regret rate is something less than 1%. But what the right wants us to do is literally, well, not literally, but throw the baby out with the bathwater. Do away with the 99% success rate that literally saves lives to avoid that tragic less than 1%. That makes no sense.
Yeah, in my research, I found only one 15, almost 16-year-old trans boy who had monster breasts modified, and a 17-year-old, almost 18-year-old trans young woman had surgery, and that's it. And that's it. But in both those cases, there was just a mountain of evidence accumulated by an army of professional people, and these were last-ditch efforts to improve the life of these two young people. So again, they keep telling us that kids are being mutilated, but where's the proof?
I have a theory.
Okay, go ahead.
Maybe they're keeping it with the proof of a stolen presidential election.
You know what? I know where the proof for all that is.
Where is that?
It's in the basement of the Alamo.
Wait a minute. I've been to the Alamo. It don't have a basement.
Well, that's where Pee Wee Herman went to find his bicycle.
Okay. Well, we have a whole bunch more to cover on this, but we've gone almost 10 minutes longer than we planned to, so there's going to be a part 2. Isn't there?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So we have reached that point where we are going to wrap up, and we do that. We've started a few episodes ago with a trans truism. Jerry Ann, do you have the copy in front of you for that?
I do.
Okay, here it comes.
We've all heard it said that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Or the only thing necessary for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. We agree. And that's why I'm happy to share with you something shared by my Facebook friend, Megan Fairbanks. You weren't the gunman, but you didn't want to see LGBT people kissing in public. You weren't the gunman, but you don't like LGBT characters on TV. You weren't gunmen, but you think LGBT people are sinful and need saving. You weren't the gunman, but you were upset when LGBT people gained the right to marry. You weren't the gunman, but you used slurs for LGBT people. You weren't the gunman, but you would vote against legal protections for LGBT people. You weren't the gunman, but you're the culture that built him. You are the bullets in his gun.
Duh.
All right. We will be working on the second part of this episode this coming week, so look for it where all your fine podcasts are aired. You have been listening to Trans Truth, the podcast that speaks the truth about what it means to be transgender. If you are transgender yourself, you have a friend or loved one who is transgender, or if you are simply looking to understand more about the transgender experience, we hope that you have found this episode to be informative and enlightening. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact us at info@transtruth.info. Copyright 2023 Trans Truth.